My guest this hour is Glenn Roper. He is an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation, a nonprofit legal organization that defends Americans' liberties when threatened by government overreach and abuse. He recently penned an article for The Hill entitled, "Yes, We Should Follow the Science, but Who Should Make the Decisions?" And I invited him on to discuss it. Here is the first segment of our interview. Glenn, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Charles. Good to be on. I appreciate you having me.
I brought you on to talk about your recent piece at The Hill entitled, "Yes, We Should Follow the Science, but Who Should Make the Decisions?" What made you write the piece?
Well, I wrote this article based on some of what we've been seeing at the Pacific Legal Foundation about steps that governors and other leaders are making at the state and local level, and some of the justifications that they're providing for restrictions that they're imposing.
Let's start there. So there's a lot of noise. We also have a problem because it's one-sided. We can get into that if you want, but COVID hit. People were concerned, to be fair to all parties. We didn't know how bad it was going to be. There was an uncertainty, and so people tend to err on the side of caution. So you can't really blame people for taking extreme measures, or at least considering them early on. But here we are, going on 2 years in, and we're still grasping at straws. And at some point, as you write in your article, the focus of what to do became centered around following the science. But like many things, there's never really a consensus on what that science is, right? It's like climate change or anything else. People say the science is settled, but the whole point of science is we are studying things. And as we gain more information and as things evolve, we come out with new information as we know it. So to say that there's one piece of science that all of us everywhere should be using as our guide is a little strange, isn't it?
Yeah, and you hit on a number of important points there. You talked about how at the beginning there was a lot of uncertainty, and I think rightfully so. The American people, we gave our leaders a lot of slack at the outset in making some decisions. You know, it was scary times. It's almost hard to remember how we felt during those early months of the pandemic, but it was scary, it was uncertain, and I think when you have a start of an emergency like that, of course, we want to allow the government to act with some flexibility and nimbleness. We are way past that now, you know, a year plus into the pandemic, and we're still seeing some of the same emergency justifications used, and that's concerning. But to go to the science piece, you know, you hit on the important question of what science is. It's not a belief system, right? It's a process. And I should tell you, I love science. We should all be very grateful for the scientific method and how that has been applied in, for example, coming to understand this virus and develop vaccines for it. You know, you go back 100 years, none of that was even possible. Even the understanding of, you know, what is a virus and how is it composed and how does it affect the human body, which isn't to say that we understand that all perfectly now, but we are very fortunate to live in a time where over the decades, application of the scientific method and scientific processes have enabled the advances that we've seen. All right, so now I want to set all that aside and talk about who makes the policy decisions. That was really my focus here. You know, I'm not a scientist, I'm a constitutional attorney. And, you know, one of the issues that's very important to me is the separation of powers in our government, because that affects who is able to make the decisions. And when you have something like this, where science is saying, you know, here's what we know about the virus, here's how it's affecting people, we're obviously seeing people get sick, seeing people die, that still, you know, science cannot answer the question of who should decide what policies we implement. That is just not the role of science. That is the role of politics. And here in our representative democracy, we elect people for the purpose of making those decisions, taking into account the science from whatever, you know, whatever level of certainty and whatever source it comes from, but then also evaluating the trade-offs that come with policy decisions. how are businesses going to be affected? How are school children going to be affected? How is our society going to be affected by these policy decisions? And then they make those decisions. It's not science that dictates, yes, you should or should not close schools. Science can say, here's what we know about the spread. Here's what we know about some ways to prevent the spread of COVID. But ultimately, science can't say, so you should shut down all elementary schools. We need people to make those decisions, and that's what we elect our representatives for. We can talk in a minute about some of the things that we've seen in cases we've litigated at the Pacific Legal Foundation. But it's very concerning when you hear people, and it should be a red flag anytime you hear a politician say, I'm just following the science, because that's not the role of science. That's not how science works.
Wow. Yeah. I think that you being a constitutional attorney is important, and we need to talk about those things you mentioned. But I still kind of get hung up on the science, not particularly what it says, because I understand that you find out more new information that changes. But the fact that, like you said, the scientists aren't saying this is what we found and this is what's the best way to react to it scientifically. They're basically making policy. They're saying this is what we found, so you should do X. You shouldn't go to the grocery store, or you should go here, or you should, that kind of thing. It's not just like, keep a distance, or, it's not simple stuff like that. And there are also scientists that don't necessarily say those things. And this kind of circles back into your purview, but on a different side. When you talk about, I know there's a big fight on big tech and social media, because the public square, because that's what they are now, is being controlled by certain individuals who are ideological, and they are dictating what can get through. So if a scientist, a legitimate actual scientist, does research and finds something that is opposite of what the other scientists are saying, they can just decide that you're not allowed to see it or hear it. And if you post it, it gets taken down. That is also a problem. So you talk about the government and the policymakers, but isn't that also a problem?
Sure. And we are, I think it's important to keep in mind, we are not a scientific oligarchy. We don't run based on decisions of science. We have decided through the Constitution, how that was set up and how our system of government is set up, that we have elected representatives who are to make these decisions. And this call of follow the science too often turns into, trust me, I'm an expert. And we get these unelected bureaucrats at the CDC and other agencies that they start being given the almost the imprimatur of the government to be able to rule our lives. And that's contrary to the system that is set up. And it's a wise system. There are very good reasons why it's set up the way it is, with checks and balances among the different areas of government. And when you start turning it into I don't want to name specific names, because that's not the point. But when individuals are viewed as, because this person has a degree, or because this person is a scientist, therefore they are the expert who should be able to govern our lives. And that's not the system that we have set up, and it's dangerous.
Well, let's talk about the system a little bit. You kind of stole a little of my thunder, but every time I get an attorney specifically that one who does what you do, I have to get back on my high horse and talk about this, because I love to hear the responses. Because as someone who's not an attorney, this is important, and it's good for other people to hear it. It may be better coming from you. So, but you talk about us not being a scientific oligarchy, but we have moved in that direction, not scientifically, but to the unelected bureaucrats, which I complain about all the time. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Elected officials appoint people to run these departments. Then they abdicate the responsibility that we've given them, and they just let them make the decisions, and they do what they say. You said you weren't going to say names, but I'm not really saying anything negative about the guy. But early on, Fauci said that. He said, my job is just to tell you what I think this virus is doing. I'm not a politician. You all decide the rest of the stuff. And he was 100% right about that. But that shifted after a couple of months when we started propping him up and calling him America's doctor. Then he became to start making recommendations, policy recommendations, and saying what we should do. Coming up, more with Glenn Roper, attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. You are listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
We return to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. Once again, here's Charles Love.
Are you tired of summer nights in Maine?
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Glenn Roper, an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation, and we are discussing following the science and how that relates to government policy. And in the last segment, I was on one of my regular refrains about the problems of unelected bureaucrats and how Fauci started off knowing his place and saying it's not his job to talk about policy. And that has now shifted. And here is Glenn's response.
For sure. And there's even another level removed, which is Congress is supposed to be the body, we're talking about the federal system, of course, that makes the laws. But they have abdicated their responsibility by creating these entities, these bureaucracies, and then giving them vague mission statements, go and do good things. And then, of course, you have these entities, these administrative agencies, who sometimes aren't even controllable by the president or by our elected representatives, who then, taking this vague mandate from Congress, they go out and make rules and regulations, including criminal penalties that apply.
That's what I was going to say. They basically have the force of law once they do it.
Exactly. And the courts have developed these dangerous doctrines that then say, well, if you have an agency that makes a rule, we're going to defer to what that agency's interpretation of the statute is. It builds upon itself. You have Congress that abdicates its responsibility. You've got the head of the executive branch and who is elected, who then hands off power to the agencies or defers to them. Then you have the court system that also is saying we're going to defer to the views of the administrative agencies. And when it adds up, all those things put together is a real imposition on the freedom of Americans to run our lives and do our businesses and evaluate risks for ourselves. Government should be providing us scientific information, not hiding it, not misleading us about what the science is, but then allowing us as much as possible to exercise our freedoms and evaluate risks and decide what risks are acceptable, what risks are not in running your business, in living your everyday life. And I think the pandemic has really opened our eyes to some of the dangers that come from the way that the system has been perverted from the normal separation of powers that should be in place into having these bureaucracies who, on what basis should Dr. Fauci be providing any policy decisions? He wasn't elected. I didn't vote for him. Nobody voted for him. Doesn't mean he's not educated. Doesn't mean he doesn't have good ideas. But, on what basis should he have the right to prescribe policy that binds the American citizenry?
Give me some examples of ways in which you think that the elected officials have not followed the Constitution in the way they applied the rules of the executive orders they signed, whether the executive orders were constitutional or not, just those kind of things. Just they got this information right or wrong from the scientists, and what was wrong with what they did with that information?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of examples. There have been some United States Supreme Court cases that decided some of these, where, for example, in New York, you had lockdown restrictions on businesses, but then certain types of businesses were open and able to operate and not others. And what we heard in some states, including New York, is that churches were considered non-essential and they were closed down and not allowed to operate at the same level as other kinds of entities. And the Supreme Court, rightfully so, came out and said, no, our first freedom in the First Amendment to the Constitution is the freedom of religion. And at the very least, that means it can, religious practice cannot be discriminated against, put at a lower tier, a worse tier. So we've seen those decisions from the Supreme Court. But let me give you an example of one of our cases. This is in Connecticut. The governor came out and said, we're going to shut down businesses, as happened in many places in the country, but then started reopening businesses. And we had a client who owned a nail salon. And the governor said, well, following the science, based on the science here, I'm going to allow hair salons to reopen, but not nail salons. And there's simply no science, no credible scientific basis for saying that the risk profile of a hair salon is different than a nail salon. It was really just sort of an arbitrary exercise of government power. And so we brought a lawsuit on behalf of our client there in Connecticut, saying that the government power cannot be exercised in arbitrary ways that damages businesses. The defense was, we're following the science, but when it came down to it, that was an empty call. There was really no scientific basis on which they could make this distinction. And unfortunately, we've seen things like that across the country where, the governor in California closed outdoor dining, even though there was no scientific data, no credible information to say that there was a risk of spread during outdoor dining. So you have these restaurants, these businesses where people pour their hard-earned resources into developing this business, and then at the whim of a government official, it gets shut down. And they use this call, well, we're just following the science, but more often than not, that's simply an excuse to avoid accountability for their decisions, an excuse to try to shut down and silence opposing viewpoints, and then impose, arbitrary policy preferences. And I could give you other examples of cases, but those are just a few where we've seen the governors or the executive branch, federal or state or even local, imposing these restrictions that harm everyday Americans, harm business people, harm landowners, all in the name of following the science.
I wonder often why the only people who question it have to be politically aligned somehow.
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that. It may have something to do with the views on freedom versus government power. But let me give you an example that's even worse. You mentioned changing positions, and to some extent that's okay with science. We would expect that. In fact, the scientific method should constantly be re-examining and questioning. With that, of course, should come some humility in how certain we are in saying this is what the science says, and telling us here's the uncertainty. And I think for some reason there's this impulse to have to be 100% certain about everything, rather than being willing to admit to the uncertainty that we have. But here's where it gets even worse, and the mask mandates early on is a good example. Back in March and February of last year, you had states, you had Dr. Fauci telling the American people, do not buy masks, do not go out and use masks. They're not going to help in this situation. Well, it turns out that was not based on scientific analysis or based on their understanding of the science.
It's an inventory.
Yeah, they were worried that there was going to be a run on the mask and that it would keep the medical personnel from getting them. So in effect, they were misleading, I don't know if you want to call it lying, but at least misleading the American people about the benefit of wearing masks, supposedly with a good purpose. But the problem is when you're in those leadership roles and you say something that is not true, even if it's with a good purpose, it just shoots your credibility, and I think we're still feeling the effects of that today. How can you trust that what they're telling you today isn't trying to mislead you about something else for a supposedly good purpose? And that's what really concerns me. The fact that science changes and evolves and comes to new understanding, we would expect that. We would want that. We don't want to be stuck in the science of 50 or 100 years ago. And that's one of the beautiful things about the scientific method, is that it enables that advancement. But when it doesn't come with that humility that should come with it, and even worse, when there is directly misleading the public, that's about as anti-scientific or at least anti-democratic as I think you can get. So that's one of the concerns I have, more than the fact of changing science. To go to your question about why it seems to become partisan, who knows? Our past president was so polarizing that may have had something to do with it, where everything, if he said one thing, the other party had to go 100% the opposite direction. And it may just be the politicization of everything. But it is unfortunate that freedom is an American value. It's not a left value or a right value or liberal or conservative. It's what our country was founded on. And I would hope that all of us would want our representative leaders to seek to give us as much freedom as is possible. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that in far too many cases.
Coming up, more with Glenn Roper, attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. You are listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Glenn Roper, attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. And in this segment, I start by asking the constitutional lawyer, can you force the vaccine?
That is a great question without a clear answer, unfortunately. The case that everybody cites in this area is from 1910, the Jacobson case, when there was a smallpox vaccine and this minister refused to get vaccinated. They slapped a $5 fine on him, and then the Supreme Court upheld the fine. Now, does that say that the government can force people to get vaccinated? No. Does it say that the government, rather than imposing a fine, can totally shun you from all aspects of public life? No, it doesn't say that. Could it potentially support that kind of a regime? Well, I think it's an open question, all of which is to say we do not have a clear answer from the Supreme Court as to whether vaccines can be mandated. And so I hesitate to, offer a legal opinion. I will say the fact that we're still operating under an emergency use authorization for the vaccines. They have not been finally approved by the FDA and are still just in this kind of preliminary category where there hasn't been sufficient testing. I would be much more nervous about, imposing mandates there. Of course, you look at other kinds of vaccines that are required to, enroll your children in school and whatnot. We certainly have those today across the country, but those are vaccines that have been tested, finally approved, determined to be safe for children at any age. And so I think it's a different question there than the question of the current COVID vaccine. But if you're asking the constitutional question of can it be mandated, I've got to say it's unclear. We may get an answer from the Supreme Court on that if we start seeing these mandates imposed. But right now, we just don't know one way or the other.
Another thing that needs to be factored in is for those vaccinations that they make kids take to go to school. You're not shunned out of all of society for that, right? If you don't take it, you can't go to public school, but you can still go to the grocery store, the restaurant, and courthouse. So that's one important piece. But the other piece I find interesting is you would think the argument from the attorneys on the other side would have to be arguing against it from a premise of efficacy versus infection, because smallpox had a high infection death rate.
Yeah,
even
30%,
with
I think.
Right. And here we talked about something different.
Yeah. Well, and you also touched on the natural immunity point, for the individuals who had COVID and recovered and to have developed those antibodies. What is the point of mandating a vaccine for those individuals who already have developed natural immunities? And I think it's also important to keep in mind the incentives here. And this is what we should be wanting our elected officials to think through. If you have somebody who's in the gray area, who's persuadable, maybe I'll get the vaccine, maybe not, but I haven't gotten it yet. And if you want to encourage that individual to get the vaccine, right? We're talking about incentives here. Much of what government does is focused on incentives. If you say to that person, if you get this vaccine, you will be able to go back to your normal life. You can, do more or less what you used to do before the vaccine, versus saying, if you don't get the vaccine, there's mask mandates, there's, these certain parts of society that are closed off for you. obviously that person is going to have some additional incentive to get the vaccine. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now with for example, with the CDC's latest guidance, they're saying even if you have the vaccine, you still have to wear a mask, or we're recommending that you wear a mask, which of course is being turned into a mandate in some places. Mm-hmm. We're still recommending that you don't do all of these normal things. Well, you totally undermine the incentive of that individual to make that free decision to get the vaccine. And what I would hope is that our elected officials, the CDC says, here's what the science is telling us about the vaccine, that you would also take into account the trade-offs and say, well, you know what? That's true. There may be these additional risks, but there's also this incentive that comes, and we want to encourage people to get the vaccine. So no, we're gonna keep it free and keep it, allow people these freedoms if they have the vaccine. So I am much more in favor of allowing freedom in all circumstances. You talked about businesses. In my view, if a business wants to say to come to my establishment, you need to be vaccinated, they should be free to do that. Make that business call, and then you got the business next door that can decide, well, do I get a competitive advantage from saying, no, I'm not going to require a vaccine card? Or maybe there's a competitive advantage, you think, from saying, no, I am going to require vaccines, because then you can come here knowing that all the patrons are going to be vaccinated. So allowing those kinds of freedoms versus these top-down government mandates, at this point, Charles, if you are an American or an adult in America, you have either had the vaccine or the vaccine is available to you if you want to get it. We're not the situation that we were months ago, or that some countries unfortunately are facing today, where it's just not an option to get vaccinated. So here, everybody who's an adult, 12 and up, who wants to get vaccinated can and has had that opportunity. I think it's time to open up and allow us the freedoms that are guaranteed under the Constitution.
Coming up, more with Glenn Roper, attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Glenn Roper, attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. And here I ask him, one, if he thinks that they are hurting their chances of increasing the vaccination rate because they are at the same time implying through their actions that the vaccination is not that effective, and that regardless of what happens with whether or not the government can mandate the vaccine, that it's a problem that they're forcing business owners to be their proxy and be the ones who enforce the showing of vaccination cards.
No, I think you're right. I think that's an important piece. And, that is not, it feels un-American to be required to show this vaccination card. Of course, we have to show, IDs to buy a drink, to get into certain establishments. So that's not foreign to us. But when the government is mandating things, there's a question, does requiring you to show a vaccination card, is that a search under the Fourth Amendment if the government is requiring you to do that? But I think you point to, again, going back to incentives and obviously the law is my expertise. We're going a little bit beyond the constitutional law here. But I do think if you're talking about the role of government and the role that we want our elected leaders to play, it is to evaluate these kinds of trade-offs. And going back to my article, when instead you say, just say the science forces us to do this one thing, that ignores the point that we need and want our elected officials to be taking these different trade-offs into account, to be considering what are the incentives that this particular program will give or will take away from people. And when they consider those trade-offs poorly, they should be held politically accountable for that. But there's not a scientific analysis anywhere that would say science requires us to show vaccine cards. That is a political decision, and one that I think you should make your voice heard. All of us should make our voices heard with our elected representatives about these kinds of issues, what we think is appropriate, what we don't think is appropriate. And so I would encourage you and your listeners to, make your voices heard. Contact your elected representatives. Let them know what you think about this issue, about vaccines and vaccine cards, and what they should or should not be doing. But as an attorney, my concern that I've seen throughout these last year or 16 months has to do more with the role of government, the separation of powers. Whether we are allowing these emergency declarations to extend beyond the point of those early days where we had the uncertainty about what was going on, and when we've got governors across the country who are continuing to exercise emergency powers, in air quotes there, more than a year into this pandemic, something has gone horribly wrong when the legislatures have had sufficient time to evaluate and decide if there are any new laws that need to be enacted, and to do so. And, when you have governors who are now saying, no, I'm continuing to operate under these continuing emergency resolutions, it feels a lot more like an authoritarian government or a dictatorship than an executive following the rule of law and following the laws that are established by the legislature.
Yeah, well, you said that we're moving a little beyond your role, but I don't know. I think all this stuff is going to end up in court. So I think it's definitely going to. It's just got to wind its way down to that. But the government, but it's weird. What I'm hearing is the government. So even with the private businesses, so you say, well, private businesses, they want to do that, and if it hurts their business, help them, they're doing that. But it's not really coming from them, though. At least not in where went with New York. New York was weird. New York did not reimpose a mask mandate, but they're telling businesses to ask for a vaccination card. So it's not. So some of these businesses feel I'm being forced to. So now they have to fight the government as a proxy for me, right? So even though I feel that I don't want that restaurant asking me for the vaccination card, the restaurant's tour is saying I don't want to ask for it. Cuomo's telling me I have to. So it's still, even though I was talking about the business, it still becomes a legal challenge because the government is, again, abdicating their responsibility. They don't want to force you to walk around with a vaccination card, but they want to force the businesses to ask you for it. So,
yeah. And thank you for clarifying that. My point was businesses should be able to, if you always see these signs, no shirt, no shoes, no service, right? Well, if you've got a bar, if you've got a bar on the beach, maybe you want to allow people to come in without a shirt on and to come in barefoot, and you think that'll help your business. Yeah, and same thing with the vaccine cards. If you make a business decision to do that, I think you should be allowed to make that decision. Right. But I agree with you. The problem is when the government comes in and says, we are going to mandate this, we are going to require this, and you business, you don't get to have that freedom anymore to decide whether it's a business question. And, you individual on the street, responsible adult, you don't get to decide whether you're going to make the decision of getting the vaccine or not, or carrying a vaccine card or not. It's a question of government infringement on individual liberty. And so by saying that, a business should be able to make that decision, I think that's a totally separate question from can the government come in and force these kinds of things? And I think it's unfortunate that we're seeing those kinds of mandates imposed, particularly when it is just either unelected bureaucrats or executive branch officials doing it without authorization from the people's elected representatives in the legislatures, who are supposed to be the ones creating the laws rather than the governor or the head of whatever state or federal agency we're talking about.
Coming up, my final segment with Glenn Roper, attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Glenn Roper, attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. And lastly, just tell us a little bit about some stuff that you may be working on with the Pacific Legal Foundation, or any lawsuits that people may be interested to hear about.
Yeah, I've got a great job at the Pacific Legal Foundation. Every day I get to deal with constitutional law, which it's tricky to do as an attorney. There aren't many jobs where you have that opportunity. You talked to a couple of my colleagues, Wen Fa and Aaron Wilcox, about a couple of cases, and I'm actually working on both of those cases.
The farmer.
The PJ High School in Virginia, the admissions process there, and then the farm loan issue where loans are being forgiven just on the basis of race across the country, and we're representing a number of farmers challenging the government on that, and again, that's an issue that should not be left, right, or center. We should all be concerned anytime that the government is imposing burdens or granting privileges to people based on the color of their skin rather than an individual analysis of their situation. And so we, at Pacific Legal Foundation, we try to stand up for people's rights across the country: property rights, equality rights, freedom of speech, and the separation of powers is another important part of what we're trying to do, and keep the government branches in their appropriate roles as was designed wisely under the Constitution.
Wow, but you all do great work, and I think that people should check you out if they need help or try to support you in whatever way they can. He is Glenn Roper, attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. Glenn, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, Charles. If people want more information, they can go to our website, pacificlegal.org, and learn about what we do.